Hello everyone, and welcome to Word of Mouth. For those of you who don't know, Word of Mouth is an adult story time presented by the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial Library System. My name is Andrew, and today I'll be reading two stories for you. We'll be reading The Lottery by Shirley Jackson and The Catbird Seat by James Thurber. If you enjoyed today's readings and would like to watch the next program, Word of Mouth is broadcast on the first and third Thursday of every month at 12:10 p.m. Central Time. You can watch it live through the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial Library's Facebook page at MCCPL Morgan, or you can watch it later on the Montgomery City County Public Library's YouTube page. That's all the announcements I have. Let's get started. The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took around 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, setting the smoothest and rounding stones for themselves. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced his name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers and sisters. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together, away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teenage club, and the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was hesitation before 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son. Baxter came forward to hold the box steady on the stool, while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had constructed when the town first had people settle in to make a village. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stained. Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had all been very well when the village was tiny, but now that the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing, it was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them in the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it back to the square next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves' barn, and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery and left there. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were lists to make up of heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household of each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster as official of the lottery. At one time, people remembered, there had been a recital of some sort, performed by the official of the lottery. A perfunctory, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believed that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people, but years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had also been a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed with time, until now it was felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at all this, in his clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting carelessly on the black box. He seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutcheson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders and slid into place in the back of the crowd. "Clean forgot what day it was," she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and they both laughed softly. "Thought my old man was out stacking wood," Mrs. Hutcheson went on, "and then I looked out the window and the kids were gone, and then I remembered it was the 27th and came a-running." She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacroix said, "You're in time, though. They're still singing to get up there." Mrs. Hutcheson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes your Mrs. Hutcheson," and "Bill, she made it after all." Mrs. Hutcheson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutcheson said, grinning, "Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter ran through the crowd as the people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutcheson's arrival. "Well now," Mr. Summers said soberly, "guess we better get started, get this over with so as we can get back to work. Anybody ain't here?" "Dunbar," several people said. "Dunbar, Dunbar." Mr. Summers consulted his list. "Clyde Dunbar," he said. "That's right, he's broke his leg, hadn't he? Who's drawing for him?" "Me, I guess," a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. "Wife draws for her husband," Mr. Summers said. "Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie?" Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. "Horace is not but 16 yet," Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully. "Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year." "Right," Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, "What's the boy drawing this year?" A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. "Here," he said. "I'm drawing for my mother and me." He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, Good fellow, Jack, and glad to see your mother's got a man to do it. Well, Mr. Summers said, guess that's everyone. Old man Warner make it. Here, a voice said, and Mrs. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. All ready? He called. Now, I'll read the names, heads of families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hands without looking at it until everyone has a turn. Everything clear? The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, Adams? A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. Hi, Steve, Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said, Hey, Joe. They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned, and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his head. Allen, Mr. Summers said. Anderson. Bentham. Seems like there's no time at all anymore between lotteries, Mrs. Delacour said to Mrs. Graves in the back. Seems like we go through the last one only last week. Time sure goes fast, Mrs. Graves said. Clark. Delacroix. There goes my old man, Mrs. Delacour said. She held her breath until her husband went forward. Dunbar, Mr. Summers said. Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, Go on, Janie, and another one said, There she goes. We're next, Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd, there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. Harbert. Hutchison. Get up there, Bill, Mrs. Hutchison said, and the people near her laughed. Jones. They do say, Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery. Old Man Warner snorted. Pack of crazy fools, he said, listening to the young folks. Nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves, nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery, he added petulantly. Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody. Some places have already quit lotteries, Mrs. Adams said. Nothing but trouble in that, Old Man Warner said stoutly. Pack of young fools. Martin. And Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. Overdyke. Percy. I wish they'd hurry, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. I wish they'd hurry. They're almost through, her son said. You get ready to run till Dad, Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, Warner. 77th year I've been in the lottery, Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd. 77th time. Watson. The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, Don't be nervous, Jack. And Mr. Summers said, Take your time, son. Zanini. After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, All right, fellas. For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons? Then the voices began to say, It's Hutchison. It's Bill. Bill Hutchison's got it. Go tell your father, Mrs. Dunbar said to the older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchisons. Bill Hutchison was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hands. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchison shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him enough time to take any paper he wanted. I saw it. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport now, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, "All of us took the same chance." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchison said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time." He consulted his next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchison family. You got any other households in the Hutchisons?" "There's Don and Eva," Mrs. Hutchison yelled. "Make them take their chances." "Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone else." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "I guess not, Joe," Bill said regretfully. "My daughter draws with her husband's family. It's only fair. And I've got no other family except the kids." "Then, as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too, right?" "Right," Bill said. "How many kids, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked formally. "3," Bill Hutchison said. "There's Bill Jr., and Nancy, and little Dave, and Tessie and me." "All right, then," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you got their tickets back?" Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. "Put them in the box, then," Mr. Summers directed. "Take Bill's and put it in." "I think we ought to start over," Mrs. Hutchison said as quietly as she could. "I tell you, it wasn't fair. They didn't give him enough time to choose. Everybody saw that." Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground, where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. "Listen, everybody," Mrs. Hutchison was saying to the people around her. "Ready, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchison, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. "Remember," Mr. Summers said, "take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave." Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy who came willingly with him up to the box. "Take a paper out of the box, Davy," Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. "Take just one paper," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you hold it for him." Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist, and held it while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. "Nancy next," Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. "Bill Jr.," Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, nearly knocked the box over as he got his paper out. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a moment, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched the paper out and held it behind her. "Bill," Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchison reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with the slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy," and the sound of the whisper reached the edge of the crowd. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said. "Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd, holding their slips of paper above their heads. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchison, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchison went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it. The black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with a heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchison held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summer said. "Let's finish this quickly." Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use the stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands, and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead, and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchison a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchison was in the center of the cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It ain't fair! It isn't!" Mrs. Hutchison screamed, and then they were upon her. The Catbird Seat by James Thurber. Mr. Martin bought the pack of Camels on Monday night in the most crowded cigar store in Broadway. It was theater time, and 7 or 8 men were buying cigarettes. The clerk didn't even glance at Mr. Martin, who put his pack in his overcoat pocket and went out. If any of the staff at F&S had seen him buy the cigarettes, they would have been astonished, for it was generally known that Mr. Martin did not smoke, and never had. No one saw him. It was just a week to the day since Mr. Martin had decided to rub out Mrs. Old Jean Barrows. The term rub out pleased him because it suggested nothing more than the correction of an error. In this case, an error of Mr. Fitweiler. Mr. Martin had spent each night of the past week working out his plan and examining it. As he walked home now, he went over it again. For the 100th time, he resented the element of imprecision, the margin of guesswork that entered into the business. The project as he had worked it out was casual and bold. The risks were considerable. Something might go wrong anywhere along the line. And therein lay the cunning of his scheme. No one would ever see in it the cautious, painstaking hand of Erwin Martin, head of the filing department at F&S, of whom Fitweiler had once said, "Man is fallible, but Martin isn't." No one would see his hand, that is, unless it were caught in the act. Sitting in his apartment, drinking a glass of milk, Mr. Martin reviewed his case against Mrs. Old Jean Barrows, as he had every night for 7 nights. He began at the beginning. Her quacking voice and braying laugh had first profaned the halls of F&S on March 7th, 1941. Mr. Martin had had for dates. Old Roberts, the personnel chief, had introduced her as the newly appointed special advisor to the president of the firm, Mr. Fitweiler. The woman had appalled Mr. Martin instantly, but he hadn't shown it. He had given her his dry hand, a look of studious concentration, and a faint smile. "Well," she had said, looking at the papers on his desk, "are you lifting the ox cart out of the ditch?" As Mr. Martin recalled the moment over his milk, he squirmed slightly. He must keep his mind on her crimes as a special advisor, not on her peccadilloes as a personality. This he found difficult to do, in spite of entering an objection and sustaining it. The faults of the woman as a woman kept chattering on in his mind like an unruly witness. She had, for almost 2 years now, baited him. In the halls, in the elevator, even in his own office, into which she romped now and then like a circus horse. She was constantly shouting these silly questions at him. "Are you lifting the ox cart out of the ditch? Are you tearing up the pea patch? Are you hollering down the rain barrel? Are you scraping around the bottom of the pickle barrel? Are you sitting in the catbird seat?" It was Joey Hart, one of Mr. Martin's 2 assistants, who had explained what the gibberish meant. "She must be a Dodgers fan," he had said. "Red Baba announces the Dodgers games over the radio when he uses those expressions. Picked him up down south." Joey had gone on to explain 1 or 2. Tearing up the pea patch meant going on a rampage. Sitting in the catbird seat meant sitting pretty, like a batter with 3 balls and no strikes on 'em. Mr. Martin dismissed it all with an effort. It had been annoying. It had driven him near to distraction. But he was too solid a man to be moved to murder for anything so childish. It was fortunate, he reflected as he passed on to the important charges against Mrs. Barrows, that he had stood up under it so well. He had always maintained an outward appearance of polite tolerance. "Why, I even believe you like the woman," Mrs. Baird had said. He had simply smiled. The gavel rapped in Mr. Martin's mind, and the case was resumed. Mrs. Eugene Barrows was charged with willful, blatant, and persistent attempts to destroy the efficiency and system of F&S. It was competent, material, and relevant to review her advent and rise to power. Mr. Martin had got the story from Miss Baird, who seemed always able to find things out. According to her, Miss Barrows had met Mr. Fitzwilder at a party where she had rescued him from the embraces of a powerfully built, drunken man who had mistaken the president of F&S for a famous retired Middle Western football coach. She had led him to a sofa and somehow worked upon him a monstrous magic. The aging gentleman had jumped to the conclusion, there and then, that this was a woman of singular attainments, equipped to bring out the best in him and the firm. A week later he had introduced her into F&S as his special advisor. On that day, confusion got its foot in the door. After Miss Tyson, Mr. Brundage, and Mr. Bartlett had been fired, and Mr. Munson had taken his hat and stalked out, mailing his resignation later, old Roberts had been emboldened to speak to Mr. Fitzwilder. He mentioned that Mr. Munson's department had been a little disrupted, and hadn't they perhaps better resume the old system there? Mr. Fitzwilder had said certainly not. He had the greatest faith in Mrs. Barrows' ideas. "They require a little seasoning is all," he added. Mr. Roberts had given it up. Mr. Martin reviewed in detail all the charges wrought by Mrs. Barrows. She had been clipping at cornices of the firm's edifice, and now she was swinging at the foundation with a pickaxe. Mr. Martin came now, in his summing up, to the afternoon of Monday, November 2nd, 1942, just 1 week ago. On that day, at 3 p.m., Mrs. Barrows had bounced into his office. "Boo!" she had yelled. "Are you scraping around the bottom of the pickle barrel?" Mr. Martin had looked at her from under his green eyeshade, saying nothing. She had begun to wander about the office, taking it in with her great, popping eyes. "Do you really need all of these filing cabinets?" she had demanded suddenly. Mr. Martin's heart had jumped. "Each of these files," he had said, keeping his voice even, "plays an indispensable part of the system of F&S. She had brayed at him, "Well, don't tear up the pea patch," and gone to the door. From there she had bawled, "But you sure have got a lot of fine scrap in here." Mr. Martin could no longer doubt that the finger was on his beloved department. Her pickaxe was on the upswing, poised for the first blow. It had not yet come. He had received no blue memo from the enchanted Mr. Fitzwilder, bearing nonsensical instructions derived from the obscene woman. But there was no doubt in Mr. Martin's mind that one would be forthcoming. He must act quickly. Already a precious week had gone by. Mr. Martin stood up in his living room, still holding his milk glass. "Gentlemen of the jury," he said to himself, "I demand the death penalty for this horrible person." The next day, Mr. Martin followed his routine as usual. He polished his glasses more often, and once sharpened an already sharp pencil. But not even Miss Baird noticed. Only once did he catch sight of his victim. She swept past him in the hall with a patronizing "Hi!" At 5:30 he walked home as usual, and had his glass of milk as usual. He had never drunk anything stronger in his life, unless you could count ginger ale. The late Sam Schlosser, the S of F&S, had praised Mr. Martin at a staff meeting several years before for his temperate habits. "Our most efficient worker neither drinks nor smokes," he had said. "The results speak for themselves." Mr. Fitzwilder had sat by, nodding approval. Mr. Martin was still thinking about that red-letter day as he walked over to the Schraffs on Fifth Avenue near 46th Street. He got there, as he always did, at 8 o'clock. He finished his dinner and the financial page at the Sun at 8:45, as he always did. It was his custom after dinner to take a walk. This time he walked down Fifth Avenue at a casual pace. His gloved hands felt moist and warm, his forehead cold. He transferred the camels from his overcoat to a jacket pocket. He wondered as he did so if they did not represent an unnecessary note of strain. Mrs. Barrows smoked only Luckies. It was his idea to puff a few puffs on a camel after the rubbing out, stuff it out in the ashtray holding her lipstick-stained Luckies, and thus drag a small red herring across the trail. Perhaps it was not a good idea. It would take time. He might even choke too loudly. Mr. Martin had never seen the house on West 12th Street where Mrs. Barrows lived, but he had a clear enough picture of it. Fortunately, she had bragged to everybody about her ducky first-floor apartment in the perfectly darling 3-story red brick. There would be no doorman or any other attendants, just the tenants of the 2nd and 3rd floors. As he walked along, Mr. Martin realized that he would get there before 9:30. He had considered walking north on Fifth Avenue from Shraff's to a point from which it could take him until 10 o'clock to reach the house. At that hour, people were less likely to be coming in or going out. But the procedure would have made an awkward loop in the straight thread of his casualness, and he had abandoned it. It was impossible to figure out when people would be entering or leaving the house anyway. There was a great risk at any hour. If he ran into anybody, he would simply have to place the rubbing out of old Jean Barrows into the inactive file forever. The same thing would hold true if there were someone in her apartment. In that case, he would just say that he had been passing by, recognized her charming house, and thought to drop in. It was 18 minutes after 9 when Mr. Martin turned onto 12th Street. A man passed him, and a man and a woman talking. There was no one within 50 paces when he came to the house halfway down the block. He was up the steps and in the small vestibule in no time, pressing the bell under the card that said Mrs. Old Jean Barrows. When the clicking in the lock started, he jumped forward against the door. He got inside fast, closing the door behind him. A bulb in a lantern hung from the hall ceiling on a chain seeming to give monstrous bright light. There was nobody on the stair, which went up ahead of him along the left wall. A door opened down the hall in the wall to the right. He went toward it swiftly, on tiptoe. "Well, for goodness sake, look who's here!" bawled Mrs. Barrows, and her braying laugh rang out like the report of a shotgun. He rushed past her like a football tackle, bumping her. "Hey! Quit shoving!" she said, closing the door behind them. They were in her living room, which seemed to Mr. Martin to be lighted by 100 lamps. "What's after you?" she said. "You're as jumpy as a goat." He found he was unable to speak. His heart was wheezing in his throat. Yes, he finally brought out. She was jabbering and laughing as she started to help him off with his coat. No, he said. "I'll put it here." He took it off and put it on a chair near the door. "Your hat and gloves, too," she said. "You're in a lady's house." He put his hat on top of the coat. Mrs. Barrows seemed larger than he had thought. He kept the gloves on. "I was passing by," he said. "I recognized... Is there anyone here?" She laughed louder than ever. "No," she said. "We are all alone. You're as white as a sheet, you funny man. Whatever has come over you? I'll mix you a toddy." She started towards the door across the room. "Scotch and soda be all right?" "But, say, you don't drink, do you?" She turned and gave him her amused look. Mr. Martin pulled himself together. "Scotch and soda will be fine," he heard himself say. He could hear her laughing in the kitchen. Mr. Martin looked quickly around the living room for the weapon. He had counted on finding one there. There were andirons and a poker and something in a corner that looked like an Indian club. None of them would do. Couldn't be that way. He began to pace around. He came to a desk. On it lay a metal paper knife with an ornate handle. Would it be sharp enough? He reached for it and knocked over a small brass jar. Stamps spilled out of it, and it fell to the floor with a clatter. "Hey!" Mrs. Barrows yelled from the kitchen. "Are you tearing up the pea patch?" Mr. Martin gave a strange laugh. Picking up the knife, he tried its point against his left wrist. It was blunt. It wouldn't do. When Mrs. Barrows reappeared, carrying 2 highballs, Mr. Martin, standing there with his gloves on, became acutely conscious of the fantasy he had wrought. Cigarettes in his pocket, a drink prepared for him. It was all too grossly impossible. It was more than that. It was completely impossible. Somewhere in the mind, a vague idea stirred, sprouted. "For heaven's sakes, take off those gloves," said Mrs. Barrows. "I always wear them in the house," said Mr. Martin. The idea began to bloom, strange and wonderful. She put the glasses on a coffee table in front of a sofa and sat on the sofa. "Come over here, you odd little man," she said. Mr. Martin went over and sat beside her. It was difficult getting his cigarette out of the pack of Camels, but he managed it. She held a match for him, laughing. "Well," she said, handing him his drink, "this is perfectly marvelous. You with a drink and a cigarette." Mr. Martin puffed, not too awkwardly, and took a gulp of the highball. "I drink and smoke all the time," he said. He clinked his glass against hers. "Here's nuts that old windbag Mr. Fitweiler," he said, and gulped again. The stuff tasted awful, but he made no grimace. "Really, Mr. Martin," she said, her voice and posture changing, "you are insulting our employer." Mrs. Barrows was now all special advisor to the president. "I am preparing a bomb," said Mr. Martin, "which will blow the old goat higher than hell." He had only had a little of the drink, which was not strong. It couldn't be that. "Do you take dope or something?" Mrs. Barrows asked coldly. "Heroin," said Mr. Martin. "I'll be coked to the gills when I bump the old buzzard off." "Mr. Martin!" she shouted, getting to her feet. "That will be all of that. You must go at once." Mr. Martin took another swallow of his drink. He tapped his cigarette out in the ashtray and put the pack of Camels on the coffee table. Then he got up. She stood glaring at him. He walked over and put on his hat and coat. "Not a word about this," he said, and laid an index finger against his lips. All Mrs. Barrows could bring out was, "Really?" Mr. Martin put his hand on the doorknob. "I'm sitting in the Catbird seat," he said. He stuck his tongue out and left. Nobody saw him go. Mr. Martin got to his apartment walking well before 11. No one saw him go in. He had 2 glasses of milk after brushing his teeth, and he felt elated. It wasn't tipsiness because he hadn't been tipsy. Anyway, the walk had worn off all the effects of the whiskey. He got in bed and read a magazine for a while. He was asleep before midnight. Mr. Martin got to the office at 8:30 the next morning as usual. At 8:45, old Jean Barrows, who had never before arrived at work before 10, swept into his office. "I'm reporting to Mr. Fitweiler now," she shouted. "If he turns you over to the police, it's no more than you deserve." Mr. Martin gave her a look of shocked surprise. "I beg your pardon," he said. Mrs. Barrows snorted and bounced out of the room, leaving Miss Peard and Joey Hart staring after her. "What's the matter with that old devil now?" said Miss Peard. "I have no idea," said Mr. Martin, resuming his work. The other 2 looked at him and then at each other. Miss Peard got up and went out. She walked slowly past the closed door of Mr. Fitweiler's office. Mrs. Barrows was yelling inside, but she was not braying. Miss Peard could not hear what the woman was saying. She went back to her desk. 45 minutes later, Mrs. Barrows left the president's office and went into her own, shutting the door. It wasn't until half an hour later that Mr. Fitweiler sent for Mr. Martin. The head of the filing department, neat, quiet, attentive, stood in front of the old man's desk. Mr. Fitweiler was pale and nervous. He took his glasses off and twiddled them. He made a small bruffing noise in his throat. "Martin," he said, "you have been with us for more than 20 years. 22, sir." said Mr. Martin. In that time, pursued the President, your work and your manner have been exemplary. I trust so, sir, said Mr. Martin. I have understood, Martin, said Mr. Fitzwilder, that you have never taken a drink or smoked. That is correct, sir, said Mr. Martin. Ah, yes. Mr. Fitzwilder polished his glasses. You may describe what you did after leaving the office yesterday, Martin, he said. Mr. Martin allowed less than a second for his bewildered pause. Certainly, sir, he said. I walked home, and I went to Shraff's for dinner. Afterward, I walked home again. I went to bed early, sir, and read a magazine for a while. I was asleep before 11. Ah, yes, said Mr. Fitzwilder again. He was silent for a moment, searching for the proper words to say to the head of the filing department. Mrs. Barrows, he said finally, Mrs. Barrows has worked hard, Martin, very hard. It grieves me to report that she has suffered a severe breakdown. It has taken the form of a persecution complex, accompanied by distressing hallucinations. I am very sorry, sir, said Mr. Martin. Mrs. Barrows is under the delusion, continued Mr. Fitzwilder, that you visited her last evening and behaved yourself in an unseemly manner. He raised his hand to silence Mr. Martin's little pained outcry. It is the nature of these pathological diseases, Mr. Fitzwilder said, to fix upon the least likely and most innocent party as the source of the persecution. These matters are not for the lay mind to grasp, Martin. I've just had my psychiatrist, Dr. Fitch, on the phone. He would not, of course, commit himself, but he made enough generalizations to substantiate my suspicions. I suggested to Mrs. Barrows that she completed her story to me this morning, that she visit Dr. Fitch, for I suspected a condition at once. She flew, I regret to say, and requested that I call you on the carpet. You may not know, Martin, but Mrs. Barrows had planned a reorganization of your department, subject to my approval, of course. Subject to my approval. This brought you, rather than anyone else, to her mind, but again, that is a phenomenon for Dr. Fitch, and not for us. So, Martin, I'm afraid Mrs. Barrows' usefulness here is at an end. I'm dreadfully sorry, sir, said Mr. Martin. It was at this point that the door to the office blew open with the suddenness of a gas main explosion, and Mrs. Barrows catapulted through it. Is the little rat denying it? She screamed. He can't get away with that. Mr. Martin got up and moved discreetly to a point beside Mr. Fitzwilder's chair. You drank and smoked in my apartment, she bawled at Mr. Martin, and you know it. You called Mr. Fitzwilder an old windbag and said you were going to blow him up when you got coked to the gills on your heroin. She stopped yelling to catch her breath, and a new glint came into her popping eyes. If you weren't such a drab, ordinary little man, she said, I'd think you planned it all. Sticking your tongue out, saying you were sitting in the Catbird seat because you thought no one would believe me when I told it. My goodness, it's really just too perfect. She brayed loudly and hysterically, and the fury was on her again. She glared at Mr. Fitzwilder. Can't you see that he has tricked us, you old fool? Can't you see his little game? But Mr. Fitzwilder had been surreptitiously pressing all the buttons under the top of his desk, and employees of F&S began pouring into the room. Stockton, said Mr. Fitzwilder, you and Fishbean will take Mrs. Barrows' dinner home. Miss Powell, you'll go with her. Stockton, who had played a little football in high school, blocked Mrs. Barrows as she made for Mr. Martin. It took him and Fishbean together to force her out of the room, into the hall crowded with stenographers and office boys. She was still screaming imprecations at Mr. Martin, tangled in contradictory imprecations. The hubbub had finally died down out in the corridor. I regret that this has happened, said Mr. Fitzwilder. I shall ask you to dismiss it from your mind, Martin. Yes, sir, said Mr. Martin, anticipating his chief's that will be all, by moving to the door. I will dismiss it. He went out and shut the door, and his step was light and quick in the hall. When he entered his department, he had slowed down to his customary gait, and he walked quietly across the room to the W-20 file, wearing a look of studious concentration. Thank you everybody for watching. That is it for our stories today. I hope you will join us next time, 2 weeks from today on the 18th at 12:10 p.m. The stories then will be The Bass, the River, and Sheila Mant by W.D. Wetherill, and A Tree, a Rock, and a Cloud by Carson McMullers. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.